everyone, welcome to Excel Basics video number 4. It is always a good day when we have to learn Excel. In our last video, we learned about number formatting, the different types of number formatting, and how to add number formatting as well as remove any number formatting. We also learned about rounding function, and we learned about the dynamic spell formula. In this video, we will learn about number formatting, but this time we are learning about date number formatting. We will learn how to calculate the dates, do the date calculations. We will also learn how to format the time formatting and as well as do the time calculations. And in addition to that, instead of doing the rounding like we did in our last video with numbers and rounding to a digit, in this video we will learn MROUND, and with MROUND, we are rounding to a multiple. As we continue our learning in this video, if you would like to follow along or work along with me, please download the Excel workbook file included below this video, or you can also download the file from our class canvas. Let's go to the date and F and calculations worksheet and learn more on date, number formatting, and calculations. As we learned in our last video, number formatting is a facade. Date is a type of number formatting. Now, if we remember from our last video, to open the Format Cell dialog box, we use Ctrl 1. Here, we can see date as a type of number formatting. We have different types that we can use for the date number format. As I scroll down, we can see the different types that we have here. And if you also would like to change the location, you also have an option to do that. If I click on this arrow, you can see that you have different options that you can change the location to. Now I'm gonna close this. I'll click on cancel. If you would like to change your computer settings for the date and time, on your search box in the taskbar, you will type settings, and then you click on that. And then on the settings, you would select time and language, click on that. And right here, you do have an option to change the date and time zones, as well as the language and region. And if you click on the time zone here or the region, you also have the same option to change the time zone and the region. So I will not change my time zone and I'm not changing my region. I just wanted to show you that if you would like to change your computer settings, this is where you would come to change the settings. So I will close that. Now, as I said, date is a type of number formatting. And since we know that number formatting is a facade, you may ask, what is the actual number or the underlying number in the cell if the date is a number format? So the underlying number in that cell is a serial number, which is a whole number that represents the number of days since December 31, 1899. So where January 1st, 1900 will be a serial number 1, and January 2nd, 1900 will be serial number 2, and January 3rd, 1900 will be serial number 3, and so forth. So I have a list of dates here and their related serial numbers. The whole numbers for the dates help us to easily do or perform the math calculations, since with the date, and we will see in this video, that we can do math calculations with the dates. We have learned from our last video that when you're doing calculations and you have number formatting, Excel formulas do not see the number formatting. So even if we format our numbers in the cell as a date, we can still do our calculations because the formula will be looking at the underlying number that is in that cell, which is a serial number. And this applies to dates and times, but on this worksheet, we'll see how to do those calculations on the date. And then on the next worksheet, we will see how to do the calculations on time. As you can see on this column, all this is formatted as a date. You can see the date number formatting right here. And on this column, all this is general number formatting, which means no specific number formatting on that. But if we could change this and format this as a date, so I'll click on that arrow, and then I will change to a short date. And now, as you can see, all this now has been formatted to dates. So as I was saying, or as I told you, the date is a type of number formatting, which means there is a number that is underlying under that cell, which is the serial number. And if I change that back to general, no specific format, this is the serial number that is underlying under that cell. And that's why with the dates, because it's a serial number, we are able to do calculations on the dates. Now you can see we have different formats of the date. When you're looking at this date, it has the day of the week, the month, the date, and the year. Now when you look at the number formatting right here, you can see this is custom number formatting. So if we press Ctrl+1 for our keyboard shortcut, you can see down here this is custom. And when you look here, you can see the way this date is formatted. It's formatted as 3 Ds for the day of the week, and then 4 M's for the name of the full month, and then DD for the date, and then the YYYY for the year. So you have different options to format the date depending on how you would like to format your date. So if I click on this one, which is right below, you can see right here, it's 3 M's, which is the abbreviation for the month, and then D for the date, and then YYYY for the full year. So you have different options to format the date as well. And if you want to format it as a long date, you can as well do that. So if I select this option right there, it gives me the day, which is like the full day of the week. And then it gives me the month completely written out, the month of the year, and the date, and then the year. So depending on how you would like to format your date, you have different options to do that, and you can do that from this option when you click on the customs, and then you select what type of date that you would like. If you would like the date and the hour, this is the option that you would choose. For us, we will leave it with that format, but I wanted to show you if you would like to change how you would show your date. This is where you would go to custom, and then you select the different type of format that you would like for your date. I'm gonna cancel that. Now you can see this one right here. We have the rails, but up here on our formula bar, we have the date, and you can see on the number formatting here, it shows the date. But it's showing as rails. It's only because the column is not wide enough to fit this. And if you can remember from our last videos, I showed you how to expand the column. So I will come up here in between these columns, and once you see that cursor, you just drag it to the right to fit whatever is in that cell. And now you can see we don't have the rails, we have the date in a format that we chose on this one. Now when you look at this other one here, we have the date typed with a different separator. So do not type the date like this, because when you type the date like this in Excel, it will default as a text, and you cannot do calculations on the text. We have learned that. So do not type the date with this type of separator. And also, do not type the date starting with the date, because if you type the date starting with the date, I will default as a text. So here in America, we type the date beginning with the month. So the month has to come first, and then the date, and then the year, if you want to type that in Excel. But if you're in a different region, then you can type the date depending on how your region types in the date in Excel. But for our class and for our case, when you're typing out the date, we will type out the date, or we will enter our data. If you are entering date in our data, we will enter our data beginning with the month, the date, and then the year. And if you want to format, then we have seen we have different ways that we can format our date. As I said, the date, the serial numbers begin in January 1st, 1900. So you can see this date here was before 1900, these two dates, that was before 1900. And you can see, even though we see this as a date, this is a text. We can tell from the way it is aligned. So we have learned that text is aligned to the left and the numbers are aligned to the right. So this is a text and this is a text, and we also cannot do the calculations on this because we will get a value error because this is a text and not a number. So our serial number for the dates, as we have said, they begin on January 1, 1900, and we can do calculations with the dates because they have the serial numbers. Now let's scroll down on our worksheet and let's type out a date here. So I have typed out this date. In the cell below, I will do a cell reference for that date. So equals, I'll do a cell reference for that date, Control Enter. And now I will change this to general. So I will use the keyboard shortcut to change this to general, Control Shift tilde. So now that is general. It has no specific format on it. And we can see right here on our number formatting, it doesn't have any formatting on it. It's general, no specific format. So now on this cell below it, I would like us to type this number that is right here, 45532, Control Enter. And now once we format this as a date, it should be the same date that we have up here. So we'll Control 1 to open our format cell dialog box, and I will select date, and we can see the date right there. The sample is whatever we have typed out as a date right here. So depending on what format that we're using, I will choose the first format type right there and I will click OK. So now you can see that the date is a serial number, and if you know that serial number or whatever number that you type in your cell, if you format that as a date, you can do that and you still can do calculations on that because, as I said, that's a serial number and you can do calculations on numbers. Now let's see the several examples that we have on this worksheet. We will do some calculations on the date. If our quarter begins on September 23rd, 2024, and we want to calculate how many days from today until the school starts, so we'll type in the date for today here, and we do have a keyboard shortcut for that. So it's Control and the semicolon. That gives you the date for today. Control Enter. So now we would like to calculate how many days until school starts. So we'll do equals, and we'll get the date when the quarter starts minus today's date. Control Enter. And we can see we have 16 days until school starts. Now let's do our second example here. And on this one, we want to calculate how many days from today until the quarter ends. So we'll type in the date for today here, but instead of using the keyboard shortcut for today's date, we will use a formula for a date that will update on every day we open this worksheet to give us a current date. So the formula for that is equals today, and you can see it returns the current date formatted as a date. And then we will close and enter. So now that gives us the current date, and anytime we open this worksheet on a different date, it will update to the current date. So now let's calculate how many days until the quarter ends. So we'll do equals the day the quarter ends minus today's date. And we can see we have 97 days from today until the end of the quarter. So let's do another calculation here. On this one, we will calculate how many days of school with Saturday and Sunday as a weekend. So that means we will not include the weekends on the number of days for the school or for the quarter. We will use a formula for that, and the formula is equals net work days. So the first one here returns the number of whole work days between two dates. But we're using the second one because we do not want to include the weekends. So this one returns the number of whole work days between 2 days with custom weekend parameters. So we'll tap to select that, and our start date is the beginning of the quarter. End date is the day the quarter ends. And then our weekends is Saturday and Sunday. If you have different weekends, you have also the option to choose from here. So for our case, it will be Saturday and Sunday. So we'll select the first option, or we can just type 1. And then we can close that and enter. And now we can see we have 60 days of the quarter, but this does not include the weekends. Now, if we want to include the weekends, let's do the same calculation here, but on this one, we will include the weekends. So we'll do equals the quarter end date minus the quarter start date. And we can see we have 81 days for the fall quarter. So now let's scroll down and do several examples as well. So if you would like to calculate how many days the invoice is due, say you're doing a business, you're issuing an invoice, and you have a day when the invoice is due, and you would like to calculate how many days until the invoice is due. So we'll do equals the day until the invoice is due minus the day the invoice was issued. And you can see if the invoice was issued back in February and it's due in November, that means you'll have 290 days to pay up that. And if you want to change the dates here and see how many days until the invoice is due, or probably you're buying something and you have some room to pay out your debt, you can do the calculation here to see how many days until your invoice is due. So now let's say you're working on a project. Let's say you're working on a finance project. The final project, the project start date is right, that date that is included there, and the project due date is there. So you can also calculate how many days that you're gonna work on the project, or how many days you have until the project is due. So to do that, we'll do equals, and we'll get the project due date minus the project start date. But because we are also calculating the project due date, we have to add 1 to include the date that the project is due as well. So plus 1 and enter. And now you can see if you're working on your final project, if the final project was available on that date and it's due on that date, then you have 44 days to complete your project. So now let's do another example here. We want to calculate the invoice due date if the contract says the amount is due at the end of the month. So I have different formulas here. The EOMONTH, this function allows you to take a date and get the end of the month for the current month. It can be either in the future or a past month. So if we do EOMONTH and then date 0, that means the current month. If we do 1, that means 1 month ahead, that's the next month. If you do -1, it means the previous month. So let's do this one until end of the month. This is the current month. So we'll do equals EOMONTH, and we get the start date, and then we put a comma to separate the arguments. And we are doing this for the end of the month, which means this current month. So we'll put a 0 and we close that. So if the invoice is due at the end of this month, that means it's due on September 30th. What if it is due next month? Let's edit that and see how that will be. So let's edit the formula. So equals EOMONTH, and we're doing a start date, and assuming it's due next month at the end of the month, so we'll put 1, and when we close that, we get October 31, which is next month at the end of the month. So for our invoice here, our question says the current month, So we'll leave it at 0 instead of 1. So let's edit our formula. We can either do Control Z to undo what we have done, or we can press F2 and edit our formula. We'll remove the 1 and type the 0 and enter. And now that is the current month. So that's the way you will calculate an invoice that is due at the end of the month. Let's do this next example here. We're calculating the invoice due date if the contract states the amount is due on the same day 3 months ahead. So it will be on the same day but 3 months ahead. So we'll use equals EDATE, and EDATE returns the serial number of the date, that is the indicated number of months before or after the start date. So we tap that to select that. So we're doing the start date, which is provided there. So if we're going 3 months ahead, that means we're putting a comma, and 3 months ahead will be 3 because we're doing 3 months ahead. If we are doing the previous months, that means we have to put either -1 for one previous month. If it's 3 months backward, then we have to put -3. For our case, it's 3 months ahead, so we'll put a 3 for the number of months, and then we'll close that and enter. So that means the invoice will be due November 10th because it's the same date, 3 months ahead. Now let's scroll down and do our last example on this worksheet. This is a customer's invoice tracking. So you would like to calculate how many days until the invoice is late, or the number of days the invoice is late. Right here on the today column right here, we will enter today's date, and we will use the formula for the current date. So anytime you open on this worksheet, the date will be the current date. So we'll do equals today. And I will double click or drag this down, whichever is easier for you. And I have the date for today. This is the current date. To get the number of days the invoice is late, we'll get the date for today minus the day the invoice was due. So we'll do equals today's date minus the invoice due date, Control Enter, and we can either double click and copy our formula down, or we can drag that. But once you see that angry rabbit, double click and your formula will copy down. Come to the last cell, F2 to verify your formula, and we can see our formula is calculating correctly. So now we can see the number of days the invoice is late. So if you prefer using the dynamic spill formula, you'll do equals, and you will select all the cells that you're using for the formula. So that's the array, minus the invoice due date. So we're selecting all the cells that we're using for that formula, or all the values that we're using for that formula, and then enter. And we can see we spilled our answers because this is a dynamic spill formula. So that's the way you will do the calculations on dates. And now we know that the dates are serial numbers that we can do the calculations on. On our next worksheet, we will see the time number formatting and also how to do the calculations on time. So let's click on Time, NF, and Calculations worksheet. As we have seen, we can do calculations with dates. We can also do calculations with time. Under the time number formatting, there's a serial number that is underneath that time formatting. So the serial number is the one that helps you make the time formula calculations. The serial number for the time is a decimal value that represents the portion of a 24-hour a day. So when you type the time value into a cell, behind the scenes or underneath that cell, Excel divides that time by 24 hours. So an example of this would be like 6 a.m., the time value. So Excel divides that by 24, which is 6 divided by 24, which gives you 6/24, which is equivalent to a quarter or 0.25. So the value in that cell will be 0.25. So when Excel is doing calculations on that, it will be using the decimal value, which is 0.25. I have a list of time here and their related Excel time serial numbers. And as you can see, on this column, I have the time. I have the portion of 24-hour a day right there. I have the fraction, what that time will be as a fraction, and the serial number in that cell, or the exact number that the Excel is doing calculations with. The exact number in that cell is the decimal number that you can see right there based on this time that I have listed here. So one thing that I would like to point out, and I have seen most students do, and they get error messages when they're doing their calculations. When you're doing the time, or when you're entering the time in your data, make sure that you're leaving a space between your number value and the text, because failure to do that gives you a text. And as you can see, this is a text, it's aligned to the left. This is a text as well. We cannot do calculations with this because this is a text. When you're entering time in your data, you need to make sure that you leave a space between the number and the AM or the PM. Now let's enter the 6 AM time right here, and we'll do a double colon. And then, as I said, do not type immediately the AM or the PM, because when you do that, now that is a text. We don't want to do that. So what I want you to do when you're entering time, you type the time that you want, the double colon, and then you leave a space, and then if it's AM or PM, then you type it out. And it doesn't matter whether you're doing it in uppercase letters or lowercase letters, because once you enter, it will default to uppercase letters. So let's enter, and we can see now that is time, and we can see the AM now is uppercase AM. And it has defaulted aligning to the right because that is a number. So we'll enter that time here again, 6 AM. Control Enter. And now this time we'll apply the general number format, which means no specific format on this. I will click right there and I will select general. And now you can see as general number format, the real number or the exact number that is in that cell is 0.25, which, as I said earlier, it's 6 divided by 24, which is a quarter, which is the same as 0.25. So 0.25 is the serial number, or it's the number that is underlying underneath the cell. When we type 6 AM, we have 0.25, and that's why we can do the calculations with our time. So now let's type here 6/24 because it's a portion of the 24 hours. So let's type equals 6/24, or 6 divided by 24. Control Enter, and you can see it's the same thing. It's a decimal, 0.25, because that's what that number is. 6/24 is the same as 0.25, or is the same as a quarter. So now on this cell, we will type 0.25, and then we will format the 0.25 as time. So 0.25, Control Enter. And then now we can see this is in general, no specific format on that. So we'll format this as time. We can either click on that arrow and format that as a time, or we can use our keyboard shortcut Control-1, and you select time and you format as a time. And you can see as well here, we have different types of format that we can select to format as. So we'll just go with the first option right there, and I will click OK. And you can see that now is formatted as a time, and it is 6 AM. So as I said, time is also a serial number, and it is a decimal value, as we have seen here. And that's why we are able to do calculations with it. So now let's scroll down and do our next example here. So since time, as we said, is a proportion of the 24 hour, That means we are dividing that time by 24 because we have 24 hours a day. That's why we are able to do the time math and get hours as a result. But to get the hours as a result, we have to multiply that decimal time answer again by 24. So to show you what I mean by that, let's do a quick calculation here. So we have these two employees, their wage per hour, their start time for their shift, and their end time for their shift. So let's calculate how many hours they worked in a day or for their shift. So if we do equals the time out, which is the end time, minus the start time, and I control enter, I get 5 a.m. So if you calculate by hand, they came in or they started work at 5 a.m. and then their shift ended at 10 a.m. So that's 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That's 5 hours. But right here it's showing 5 a.m. But because we want hours, we don't want any formatting on it. So we have to change this to general. So if I change this to general, it gives me 0.20 all those decimal hours. So we know this is not correct because we know they worked for 5 hours. Now, if I were to do a Control Z and leave it as 5 a.m., and then let's now multiply their gross pay and see how much they get when we calculate how much they are paid for their shift. And remember, we're using round, so equals round, and let's get the hours worked multiplied by the hourly wage. We're rounding to 2, so comma 2, the number of digits. And we can see they're getting paid $9. So automatically we can see that is not correct because their hourly wage is $45.75 per hour. And now the gross pay is $9.53. So that's entirely not correct. That means something is wrong here. So if we change this to general, as I did earlier, I'm going to change that to general. We can see that's not the hours that they worked. And that's why I said when we want to calculate how many hours they worked in a day, because we know that our time is a proportion of 24, to get the hours worked, we need now to multiply this by 24. So what we need to do, I will edit our formula here. I'll press F2. And because I would like the subtraction to happen first, that means I'm following the math order of operation. I have to put this into brackets or into parentheses. And then now multiply by 24. And we know we can hard code in 24 or we can type in 24. We don't have to follow the Excel golden rule with 24 because it's always gonna be 24 hours a day. It will never change. Now let's control enter and we can see now that's 12 a.m. We need to change this to general. So control shift tilde. Now that is 5 hours. And because it is hours, we need to make sure that it is general, no specific format on that. And now we can see our gross pay is calculating correctly. Now let's do this other calculation for the next employee here. We can as well copy this down, but I will not do that. I will do the calculations here for you one more time. So it's equals, we have to put that in brackets or in parentheses. We get the end time, which is the time out or the later time, minus the time in or the start time. We close our parentheses and then we multiply that by 24 hours. We have 24 hours a day and then control enter. And then we have to change this to general. So that's 4.5 hours. And now let's calculate what's their gross pay for their shift. So equals round. We get the hours worked multiplied by the hourly wage or the wage per hour. Put a comma to separate the argument. The number of digits we are rounding to the penny. So that's 2. And then we close and enter. So now that's the way you would calculate the hours worked and the gross pay. So now let's scroll down to our next example. And on this example, it's hours worked on a project. So you have a shift where you're working 2 different shifts. So let's see how we would calculate that. So we'll get the hours worked for the first shift and then the hours worked for the second shift. And then we will add that to get the total hours worked for both shifts. That is before the break and after the break. Or we can calculate that all in one formula. And I will show you both how to do it. So let's do the first one here. We'll get equals. We have to put in parentheses the time out minus the time in. Close that. And then we multiply that by 24. Control Enter. Remember, we have to change this to general because that's hours worked, it's not time. So that's calculated. Now let's calculate the next shift. We'll do equals parentheses time out minus time in. Close that. Multiply by 24. Control Enter. Change that to general. We have 4 hours for the first shift and 3.5 hours for the second shift. So now let's add that. We'll do equals the first shift plus the second shift. And we get 7.5 hours. Now, if we were to do this as one formula, instead of doing 1, 2, 3 different steps here, we'll do just one single formula to calculate both shifts. We will use the sum function. So we'll do equals sum because we want to add the hours for both shifts. And then our number 1 will be the first shift. So we'll get time out minus time in. That will be the first number. And then we put a comma to separate our numbers or to separate our argument. And then the number 2 will be the calculation for our second shift. So we'll get time out minus time in for the second shift. And then we will close that. Now the sum function, we will add the hours for that. And now we're multiplying that by 24 because we want it in hours. Multiply that by 24. Control Enter. It is formatted as a time. We need to remember that we need this in hours. So we change and remove all the formatting, put it to general. So now we can see we have 7.5 hours. So this, on this project, or if it was a shift that you were working, you worked for 7.5 hours. So the efficient formula that I would like you to use when you're calculating different shifts or when you're calculating a work that you worked on different hours, maybe it's a project, you work for certain hours, you take a break, you come back and do it again. Maybe it's your final test that you're doing, or maybe it's a test or an assignment that you're working on. You want to monitor how many hours you're working on that project. So you can log in the hours that you did when you start doing the project, take a break, come in and log in the second hours or the second shift that you did for that project. And then you can calculate your hours using this formula that we have done right there. So now let's go to our next example right here. And on this example, we're doing the timesheet calculation example. This is the employees' names. This is the days that they worked, the time that it came in, their lunch time out, and then the time that it came in after lunch, and then the end of the day when they left their office. Those will be time out, time in, and then the second shift here will be time out minus time in. So let's do the calculations on that. So we'll use this formula that we have used up here that has the sum, where we're doing just one formula to calculate that hours. So we'll do equals sum, and we'll get the first shift here that is before lunch. So time out minus time in, and then we put a comma to separate those numbers. And then we get the second one after the lunch. So time out minus time in, and then we close that and multiply that by 24. Control Enter. We need to change these and remove any time formatting on it. So change it to general, no specific format on that. And now we can copy this down. So these are the hours that this employee worked for that particular week. So the total hours for the week, we will use the sum and calculate that. So the keyboard shortcut for sum is Alt equals, and it has the correct range. So Control Enter, and those are the hours that they worked for that particular week. Now let's calculate for the second employee right there. We'll use the same formula, equals sum, we get time out minus time in, that's before lunch, and then we put a comma. After lunch, we get the time out minus time in, and we close our parentheses, multiply that by 24, Control Enter. We need to remove the time format on that to put it as general, no specific format, and then we copy that down. We have the hours for each day there for a second employee, and then the total hours that employee worked in that week. Alt equals to get the total. It has the correct range. We need to make sure that it's selecting the correct range that we are adding. And those are the hours for the second employee for that particular week. So we have another example in this worksheet. Let's scroll down. So in this example, it's the payroll calculation example. So you want to calculate how many hours each of these employees worked, what was their gross pay, the tax deduction based on the tax rate here, and then the net pay for the day. So the hours worked will do equals, we have to remember we have to use the parentheses, time out minus time in. This is hours worked. We close that. We have to multiply that by 24. Control Enter. Remove the time formatting to general, no specific format on that. And now we can come to this cell, and once we see the angry rabbit, we can just double click, copy our formula down, come to the last cell, F2. Our cell references are correct. So escape. Now we need to calculate the gross pay for this one. And for the gross pay, we have to remember that we are using the round function. So we can either use the spill or we can use the relative cell references. Either way that you're comfortable with. If you would like to use the relative cell references, it's totally fine. I will use the dynamic spill for this one. So I will do equals round, and for this one, I'm multiplying the hours worked and the wage. So I can either start with the hours worked or the wage, either one is fine. So I get the wage and make sure that I'm selecting all the cells, the values that I'm using for this formula, multiply by the hours worked. And then that is the number that I am rounding. So I have to remember to put a comma. I'm rounding to 2 digits, which is to the penny. And now I can close that and enter. And now that spills the answers for me right there. That's the gross pay. But now we have to calculate the tax deduction. Again, I will use the spill formula for this one. I don't have to worry about locking the tax rate in my formula. So, and again, I have to remember that I'm using the round function. Equals round, and my number that I'm multiplying here is the gross pay. I'm selecting all the cells or all the values that I'm using for that calculation, multiply by the tax rate. And because I'm using the spill formula, I don't have to worry about locking the tax rate. And then that's the number that I'm multiplying. I put a comma. I'm rounding that number to 2 digits, to the penny. So I put 2, close that, and enter. Now let's calculate the net pay for the day. So the net pay, we're still gonna use the spill formula. So I'm now rounding on this one because I already rounded when I'm calculating the gross pay, and I already rounded when I'm calculating the tax deduction. So I'll just get equals, select all the values that I need there for my calculation, minus the tax deduction. And now once I enter, my answers spill there. Now we'll see more examples on time calculations. And let's go to our next worksheet that has some more examples. Let's go to time calculations in MROUND. Now on this worksheet, we will calculate the timesheet But on this one, we will use also the MROUND when you're doing our calculations. Now, if you can remember from our previous video number 3, where we learned about the rounding and the different instances that we round, and also the different examples of rounding. On that video, I also had notes for you on MROUND. To refresh our memory, using round functions to round values, to round a number to the nearest digit, you use round, the number, and then the number of digits. Now for the MROUND, you're rounding a number to the nearest multiple of a value. That's why we're using the MROUND. So you get the number and then the nearest multiple. So the multiple is the multiple that you're rounding to. So in our case, we are rounding to 5 minutes. Our multiple will be rounding our time to the 5 minutes. Now let's work on this example and I will show you how to do that. On this example, we have the employees, the times that they worked, and they took a break as well. So we'll first calculate the time worked, not rounded. And on this one, I'm saying time worked, not hours worked. We'll do equals sum. We get time out minus time in, put a comma, and the other number 2 will be time out minus time in, and then close. On this one, I'm not multiplying by 24 because this is not hours worked. This is time worked. Control Enter, and you can see this is formatted as a time. And if I do Control 1, we can see this is formatted as time. It's military time format, no AM, no PM. So I'll click OK. I will leave it that way. And I can just copy my formula down. And if I want to verify, I'll go to the last cell, press F2, and I can see my cell references are correct. Now let's calculate time rounded to 5 minutes. Our multiple is 5 minutes. We'll use MROUND for this, equals MROUND, and you can see it returns a number rounded to the desired multiple. Our desired multiples in our case is 5 minutes. So we are rounding our time to the nearest 5 minutes. So for example, our first employee here, 7:56 rounded to the nearest 5 minutes will be 7:55. For 7:49 rounded to the nearest 5 minutes, this will be 7:50. Let's select MROUND. We get the time that we are rounding, which is our number. We put a comma, and we are rounding to 5 minutes. And I need to lock that because I will copy my formula down for my other employees. F4 to lock that, and then I will close that. Control Enter, and you can see now that is 7:55. Now let's copy this down. And as I said, that's 7:50. We're going to the nearest 5 minutes. That's 7:45. If you may ask, what is this 5 minutes, or how do I type in the 5 minutes? So I will click on that cell, and you can see that's 12:05 a.m. because it's 5 minutes after the clock, which is our time begins at after midnight. It's 5 minutes after midnight. If you want to type your time there 5 minutes, you will type 00:05 and then it will default to 12 a.m. And if I were to type here to show you, I'll do 00, do a colon, 05, and once I enter, this is 5 minutes. It's formatted different way as this one, but you can see on the formula bar, that's 5 minutes. And if I want to format it the same way, I can add the seconds here, and you can see that is custom. I have the hour and the minute. If I need to show the hour, minute, and the seconds, I select that, and you can see right there, it's hour, minute, and the seconds. So if I click OK, you can see now it's formatted the same way. That's the way you would type in, or that's the way you would enter your 5 minutes if your rounding multiple will be 5 minutes. I want to delete that. Now let's calculate the hours worked. We have our time rounded to 5 minutes, and now we want the hours worked. We will not use the time that is not rounded to 5 minutes, but we will use this time that is rounded to 5 minutes to calculate our hours worked. We'll multiply this time by 24 to make it 2 hours. We'll do equals the time rounded to 5 minutes, and I will multiply that by 24. Control Enter. And now I can change this to general. And now that is the hours worked. So if I copy this down, F2, I have the correct cell reference. I'm multiplying by 24. So those are the hours worked for each of these employees. So now if we were to calculate the gross pay, we'll get now the hours worked multiplied by the wage for each employee. And if you would like to use the spill formula so we don't have to worry about locking or not locking, and we don't have to worry about copying our answer down because it will just spill, I will do equals. Remember, we have to round the hours worked. I'm selecting all the cells that I'm using in the formula, multiply by the wages, getting all the values as well. So that's the number that I'm multiplying, comma, I'm rounding that to 2, and I will close that. Now let's calculate the tax deduction here. So we'll do equals, round, we get the gross pay, select all the values that we are using for our calculation. We multiply by the tax rate. We don't have to lock, we're using a spill formula. That's the number that we are multiplying, comma, to separate our arguments. We are rounding to the penny, so that will be 2. Close that and enter. So we have our tax deduction. So the net pay will be the gross pay minus the tax deduction. So equals, and we don't have to round. We get the gross pay. We already rounded our gross pay minus the tax deduction. We already rounded that as well, and enter. So now that's the way we would calculate timesheet calculation. Now let's scroll down and do our next example here. On this one, we will use a relative cell reference and absolute cell reference for this calculation. So right here, up here, we used the dynamic spill formula, but down here, I will use the absolute cell reference and the relative cell reference when we are calculating the gross pay and the tax deduction. It's the same formulas that we did here. It's just that we're not gonna do a dynamic spill formula for these ones. If you're comfortable using the absolute and relative cell reference, you can refer to this example. If you're comfortable using the dynamic spill formula, then you can refer to this example that we did right here. For the time worked, not rounded, same thing that we did above here. So we'll do equals sum. We get our time out minus time in, put a comma. We get the second shift, time out minus time in, and we close that. And then I will copy this down, come to the last cell, F2, our cell references are correct. So now let's do the time rounded to 5 minutes. We'll do equals MROUND. We get the number that we are rounding, put a comma. We are rounding to 5 minutes. That's our multiple. We'll lock that, and then we'll close it, Control Enter, and we will copy our formula down. So double click and copy our formula down. Come to the last cell, F2, our cell references are correct. So now let's calculate the hours worked. We're using the time rounded to 5 minutes, and we are multiplying that by 24 to get the hours worked. We'll do equals time rounded to 5 minutes, and we multiply that by 24 to make it hours. Control Enter, change that to general, no specific format, and we can copy our formula down. Go to the last cell, F2, to confirm your cell references, and we can see our cell references are correct. Our formula is calculating correctly. Now let's calculate our gross pay. And as I said, on this one, we're using relative cell references and absolute cell references. We do our gross pay. We have to use the round. So equals round, and we get the hours worked multiplied by the wages. That's our number. We put a comma to separate the argument. We're rounding to the penny, so that's 2 digits. And we close that. Control Enter. And then we will copy our formula down. always we have to come to the last cell, F2 to verify our cell references. That is correct and our formula is calculating correctly. Now let's calculate the tax deduction. We'll do equals round, and then we get our gross pay multiplied by the tax rate. This is an absolute cell reference, so we have to lock that. F4 to lock that. That's the number that we're multiplying. We pour a comma. We're rounding to the penny, so that's 2 digits. Close that. Control Enter, and we can double click and send our formula down. Come to the last cell, F2 to verify our cell references, and we can see that is correct and that is correct for the tax rate. That means our formula is calculating correctly. Now let's do the net pay. For the net pay, we are not rounding because we have rounded for the gross pay and the tax deduction. So we don't have to round because here we are not even multiplying or dividing. We're just subtracting. Equals the gross pay minus the tax deduction. And this is relative cell reference. Control Enter and double click to copy our formula down. F2 when you go to the last cell to verify our formula, and we can see we have the correct cell references for that. So that's the way you would do our calculations when you're doing your timesheet using the MROUND calculation. So up here we use the dynamic spill formula for our calculations, and on this example down here we use the relative and absolute cell references for our example. Whichever method you're comfortable using, as I said earlier, you're okay to use that in this class. If you like using the dynamic spill formula, that is totally fine. If you like using the relative and absolute cell references, that is totally fine as well. In this video, we have learned the date number formatting, how to format our dates and how to do calculations on the dates. We have also learned time number formatting. We have learned that time is a serial number as well, and we learned how to do the time calculations. We also learned how to do the MROUND for our time calculations. In our next video, we will learn how to calculate with different criteria. So that is it for this video, and I will see you soon in our next video. Thank you, and until then, bye-bye.